Okay, the next few tutorials are going to be about immigration patterns in the 1800s leading into the early 1900s, specifically about the Old Immigration Period in the 30 years leading up to the Civil War, and continuing with the New Immigration Period, which takes place from the Civil War over the course of the next 60 years all the way to the 1920s. It's not overly difficult to understand, but we'll keep it as simple as we can. Now, in this tutorial, we're going to take a look at the Old Immigration Period, which took place from 1830 to 1860. Okay, so please take a look at your outline, letter A, about the Old Immigration Period, which is essentially that wave of immigration that took place in the 30 years leading up to the Civil War. Now, in this Old Immigration Period, which starts in 1830, there are a couple of things that should jump out to you right away. The first is that during this time from 1830 to 1860, 91% of the immigrants coming to America from around the world are coming just from this region of Europe right here, Northern and Western Europe. Now that's an astounding number when you think about immigration history. Maybe some Asians were coming over from halfway around the world, which was happening during this time. But still, 9 out of every 10 immigrants coming to America during this time period is from Northern and Western Europe. The second thing that's probably going to jump out at you is that it's still very WASP, at least initially, just like the immigration period that had come before 1830, the colonial immigration period. Now, if you remember from prior discussions, a WASP is an acronym that's used in demographic statistics to describe anybody whose heritage is white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. The W, of course, standing for white, the AS standing for Anglo-Saxon, which means English because the Angles and the Saxons were the ones that started modern England and English culture. And then, of course, the P stands for Protestant. But what is a Protestant? Well, think of it this way. There are two major Christian groups in the world today. Catholics, and then a number of denominations that started originally because they were protesting the actions of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Now, in the early 1500s, this movement begins with what's called the Protestant Reformation, where a bunch of groups protested the actions of the Catholic Church and started their own denominations. It began with Martin Luther, who was protesting what the Catholics were doing. That's why they're called Protestants. And his group became known as Lutherans, the original Protestants. Now, I'm sure you've heard of some of the other Protestant denominations as well. For example, down in Switzerland, a guy named John Calvin protested the actions of the Catholic Church and started a group known as the Calvinists. If you go up here to this island, which is known as Great Britain, this became a very Protestant island across the board. In the west is Wales. If you're from Wales, you're Welsh. In the east is England, and up here is Scotland. And Scotland is actually where Protestantism took root in Great Britain to begin with. Calvinists had moved to Scotland and started something called Presbyterianism. The Presbyterians are essentially Scottish Calvinists. Down here in England, another Protestant group started known as the Anglicans, or the Church of England. More commonly today, they're known as Episcopalians. There are other groups like the Wesleyans, the Baptists, and the Methodists that originally started as groups who were formed because they wanted to protest what the Catholic Church was doing in the Middle Ages. Now, prior to 1830, there were plenty of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant groups in America. Our ethnic background back then in the colonial days was, the Native Americans who were already there, Africans, and then a series of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who had moved there from Great Britain, from France, from Germany, from Scandinavia. A lot of WASP groups already existed. German Protestants went there for political freedom, and more of them went from 1830 to 1860. They fit in with the WASPs who were already there, and the Scottish Presbyterians who went to America from 1830 to 1860 fit in with everybody there as well. So, what makes the old immigration period different than the waves of immigration that came before it? Well, the answer is the Irish, and it's primarily because they're Catholic. Now, Catholics and Protestants in this region had a long history of conflict. English Protestants, centuries before, had gone to Ireland and taken over the land. In fact, it was English and Irish Protestants who became the landlords and got wealthy off of all the land holdings. Meanwhile, Irish Catholics ended up being the ones who were the peasant farmers, the tenant farmers working the rocky soil where you really couldn't grow anything other than root crops like, beets, radishes, carrots, and most famously potatoes. They were breaking their backs on land that wasn't even theirs. And by the time you get to the 1840s, they really want to leave all that behind. They just don't want to be under the thumb of Protestant landlords anymore. The other part of this is the fact that one major portion of the Irish diet are potatoes, always have been. And in the 1840s, there was a rotting of the potato crop there. When you're a poor Irish farmer and that makes up your meal, a lot of your meal, it can create a starvation situation, a shortage of potatoes where there's simply not enough food in the ground to sustain the population there, and so a lot of them simply leave. The Irish came over in waves during this time period, probably knowing that they were going to be discriminated against. They probably could have made it easier on themselves by settling in the countryside, because most Protestants were in the cities, but the Irish were primarily known for settling in New York and Boston. The Protestants that were already here weren't very welcoming. Bridget is a common Irish name, and they simply started referring to every Irish woman as a Bridget, or a Biddy, short for Bridget, some cases calling them Molly Maguires, while referring to Irish men as Patricks or Paddies, or even Micks, short for Maguire, McGinnis. You get the idea. The discrimination against the Irish for being Catholic often made it pretty tough for them to find jobs. Irish women would often work in the home in domestic jobs, while men would often work in hard labor. Both were willing to receive very little pay to get past the discrimination, and this meant that they were highly disliked by other ethnic groups and other working classes, because the only way that they would get hired is if they were willing to work for less, and a lot of people took them up on that. However, the Irish had a strong reputation back in those days for disliking African Americans, who were the only group that would work for even less than they would. Now, this made it tough for the Irish and other immigrant groups when they got here, so they often sought the aid of a political machine. Now, the way a political machine works is pretty simple. A politician has a ward boss that works for him. The job of the ward boss is to get votes for the politician to make sure he gets reelected. And the politician rewards the ward boss by paying him handsomely for his services. So what a ward boss would do is pretty much every day send a group of guys over to the docks to greet immigrants as they were getting off the boat. Now, especially the Irish benefited from this because they couldn't find help anywhere. Everybody discriminated against them. But if they went to an Irish political machine, they could get assistance. Essentially, they would go see the ward boss, who would give them a place to stay, some food, and a good job, and then also get them on the road to citizenship. And with those new voting rights, they would then support the boss's candidates in upcoming elections. So as long as they did what they were supposed to do, they could keep their job, their place to stay, their food, etc., etc. Now, you have to remember, back in those days, there was no secret ballot. You had to publicly declare who you voted for. So if you didn't vote for who the boss told you to, he would take everything away. If you did, then you were all set, and the boss was very happy and very rich. Eventually, a bit of a stereotype developed because the Irish became known for using their connections to the ward boss to get jobs as police officers. This was fine with the ward boss because essentially it gave him control over the local police force. The more Irish he put there, the more control he had over the cops. And it's also the reason that you often heard of a police van in those days being referred to as a paddy wagon. Eventually, things did get better for the Irish. Many of them found wealth, started to buy property, and used some of that wealth to start Catholic parish schools, which we still see all over the country today. Now, as we said before, the Germans didn't have anywhere near as much trouble when they got here as the Irish had. And that was because they were Protestant, but they also chose to stay away from the large Protestant populations that were already here in the cities. They settled primarily in the Midwest, in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, especially Milwaukee, where a large German population developed. And German culture in the Midwest is what added Amish communities to the American identity, who often referred to themselves as Dutch because, Deutschland is how they said Germany. And so they were Deutsch. Over time, that just eventually became Dutch, even though that's technically incorrect. The Germans brought other cool things to American culture, including the Christmas tree, a form of schooling called kindergarten, and a now famous drink called beer. In fact, in the Midwest, if you look at a lot of the breweries that are there, the most famous ones come from German names: Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser, Schlitz, Pabst, Miller. These are all Germans who started breweries in the Midwest. Meanwhile, out west during the Old Immigration Period, another group was becoming a part of the American identity without having to travel anywhere to do it. The Californios, the original Spanish and Mexican settlers of California. California had become a territory of the United States and become a state in the early 1850s, so they became Americans without even having to leave their houses. They didn't come to us, we went to them. The original Californios were Franciscan monks who arrived in California as far back as 1769, even before the American Revolution, and setting up 21 missions along the Pacific coast. Eventually, the Californios became wealthy landowners who would answer only to the Franciscan monks, who were religious leaders in a heavily religious area. Now, something you should add to the outline here is the fact that the Californios were Catholic, so it was probably better that they were away from the East Coast and away from Protestant discrimination. As a result, they flourished and became some of the wealthiest people in the West, owning some of the biggest houses. By the time we get to the Civil War, these old immigrants have done pretty well for themselves, considering their ancestors' humble beginnings. But the problem was that they thought America just belonged to them. So after the Civil War, when other groups who are decidedly not WASP start arriving in the country, these immigrants that had already been here first said, "We really don't want you here. This is our country. We were here first, and you're not welcome." This led to the WASPs of the Old Immigration Period starting a movement referred to as nativism. They said that they were here first, and therefore they were the Native Americans. It's a little bit of a misnomer. I think there's another group that could lay claim to that name. Nonetheless, the nativists believed in their cause and started the American Party, which most people simply referred to as the Know-Nothings. The reason they were called the Know-Nothings is because everything they did was in secret. Nobody really knew much about them. And members of the party would say, "I don't know anything about the American Party," if they were asked if they were a part of it. They did everything in secret, and their primary job was to discriminate against non-WASP immigrants. They usually did this through politics, through literature, the media, but also often did it by force. This would be a trend that continued well on past the Civil War. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.